Before we begin, I've just got a brief disclaimer. This episode contains detailed discussion of a very violent crime, gun violence, and historical miscarriages of justice. Listener discretion is strongly advised. So last time on Forgotten FNQ, we tracked the initial search for Vikki Arnold and Julianne Leahy. And we discovered the immediate police rush to declare a murder-suicide almost within an hour of finding their bodies at Cherry Tree Creek in Far North Queensland. So we chatted about some critical initial forensic mistakes that compromised the crime scene. And today we will be really exploring some shocking discoveries, some ballistic impossible mechanics of the weapon, and some true crime magazines that were hidden in plain sight. So we'll also dive into the State Coroner who issued a warrant for murder and formally cleared Vikki Arnold's name. So, buckle up, turn down the lights, lock the doors, and let's step into Forgotten FNQ, cold cases and missing persons. On Sunday evening in August 1991, the night was falling over Cherry Tree Creek. So under standard homicide protocols, usually a remote violent crime scene will be frozen in time. Like a perimeter will be established, officers will be posted overnight, generally waiting for daylight so that all the specialised forensic units can map footprints and tyre impressions, blood patterns in situ. But instead, our regional police leadership gave an order that absolutely shattered the integrity of this crime scene. So that order was, tow the car. Julianne Leahy's white Nissan Patrol was then hooked up to a tow truck and hauled out of the scrub. It was dragged down kilometres of unsealed, unpaved rural roads to a holding yard all the way over at Youngborough. So think about what happens when you tow a vehicle that contains key physical evidence over pretty rough terrain for many kilometres. So biological evidence would shift and cross-contaminate. Shell casings could possibly dislodge from their original resting positions. Blood spatter analysis becomes nearly impossible to verify. External physical evidence like the tyre tracks and foreign footprints, even something as simple as broken foliage, it can be absolutely obliterated by the recovery operation itself. So before formal forensic analysis even took place, this crime scene was dismantled. Within hours of arriving at Cherry Tree Creek, the acting local officers declared the investigation closed. They concluded that Vikki Arnold had murdered Julianne Leahy and then taken her own life. So, from the moment that theory was declared, Vikki Arnold's family absolutely refused to accept it. They knew Vikki and they knew her well, right? So she's a 27-year-old accountant. She's meticulous, quiet, grounded. She's got zero history of violence. She's got deep family and community ties and pretty strong plans for her future. So to even paint Vikki as a murderer, it went against her natural character. It also really contradicted the physical realities of that crime scene. So where the shots were fired, where the bodies were actually found, the deep knife wounds, the 1.5 kilogram rock, the knife even that was used for those injuries. You know, where it was placed. Yeah, very, 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 very strange that the police would declare murder-suicide so quickly. So Vicky's family, from what I understand, they began knocking on doors, securing legal representation. They pushed for formal reviews. They were really determined to clear her name and force the authorities to acknowledge third-party involvement. And I really can't say I blame them, because even just looking at the initial reports, it's beyond logic to think that this woman... Yeah. Anyway, the inquest happened years and years and years later, but we'll have a look at that. It pushes past that initial police conclusion, right? So there's been many inquests, so much money spent. It's been crazy. But the attention eventually returns to Julianne's husband, Alan, and his movements during those days that his wife and her best friend went missing. So apparently what Alan was doing while search crews were dragging Lake Tinaroo, based on his statement alone, apparently he was active around Atherton. He was not really providing too many updates to police, but he was moving around the local area. There was reports that he participated in some community efforts of the searchers. And then, the inconsistencies in his initial statement had already emerged. Let's recap the service station where he attended at 6:15 a.m. on the day that they went missing, July 27th, 1991. He mentioned to that attendant that she went fishing at 2 a.m. and he did not even mention Vicki was with her. So the contrast with the timeline later provided to the police. Beyond that timeline, the coronial proceedings have really highlighted, I guess, dynamic friction inside their home. So prior to their disappearance, Julianne's home was pretty crowded, right? So they've got their own children, but Julianne's younger sisters also reside in that house. So inquest testimony also later reveals major domestic scandals were placing Alan at the centre, right? I'm not going to go into details here because that's an entirely private story with people who are still affected greatly to this day. But there was an affair between Alan and Julianne's younger sister whilst living under the same roof. So keep that in mind as this revelation adds really significant weight to existing domestic tension, and it really exposes the degree of strain inside the Leahy household prior to the women vanishing, right? So for years, authorities have tried to paint Vikki Arnold as a woman who suffered from some sort of hidden mental turmoil or unrequited obsession. However, at the third inquest, a world-renowned suicidologist, Professor Diego De Leo, examined every page of Vicki's life, her diaries, and the scene forensics. His findings were pretty clear. Vicki showed zero signs of psychopathology, zero evidence of depression, and zero indicators of suicidal ideation. She was considered organised, stable, highly competent professional who had booked client meetings for 6 a.m. the morning after she vanished. She'd even bought birthday presents for Julianne's children. So Professor De Leo also noted that in the entire history of Australian coronial data, there was not one single recorded case of a female using a firearm to execute a same-sex friend and then taking her own life in the footwell of a vehicle. So the positioning of Vicki's body, she was, keep in mind, crammed into the footwell with her feet almost touching the dirt outside, and the rifle was resting loosely. Her index finger was still on the trigger. Now that in itself is physically incompatible with a self-inflicted shot. So we also have to look at the weapon, right, recovered at the scene. Now, this is very interesting. It was a shortened .22 Ruger rifle, but as all the forensic ballistics teams and coronial inquests re-examined the physical evidence, the story behind this firearm grew so complex. Like, it blows my mind. So the searchers and investigators recovered crucial missing components associated with this firearm, including jammed bullets and discarded parts that were tied to the rifle's mechanism. So the condition and the modification of this rifle prevented some pretty interesting physical challenges. How can a shortened rifle inflict specific shot trajectories found on both women within that tight space of that vehicle in the scrub, right? Why were key ballistic items and physical evidence mislaid, lost, and even improperly logged in the initial aftermath? And rather than offering a simple resolution, the recovered firearm components raised further questions about weapon access, ownership, scene staging. So that's another interesting part, was we couldn't actually pinpoint who gave the gun to Vicki, but statements following their disappearance say that she'd asked a friend for this gun, and this friend had secured this gun and then given it to Vicki, the gun that was found at the crime scene. And that is why she had the $500 cash in her purse that was in her vehicle that was still sitting out the front of Julianne's place. Apparently and supposedly that money was to pay for this .22 Ruger rifle. How interesting that we don't also know who cut the Ruger rifle down. So the original police report claims that the gun was jammed mid-action with one live round and one spent casing. However, expert ballistics testing proved a pretty critical flaw. So if the gun jammed on live rounds, it required manual cocking to clear, right? So that's an action impossible for a person who's just suffered a fatal gunshot to the head. So furthermore, ballistics also confirmed that the cut-down rifle was modified using a pretty crude hand hacksaw with uneven angle cuts. So even though Alan Leahy had access to vices, tools, and multiple hacksaws in his home workshop, we couldn't actually prove that he'd cut this gun down. Now, cue in another interesting little piece of information that came from the inquest: true crime magazines. So early in the investigation, Alan handed over several issues of a magazine titled Murder Casebook to police, and he claimed that Vicki had borrowed them from him, right? Under cross-examination at this inquest, Alan completely feigned ignorance. Like, he denied he owned them, even though the news agency records showed the subscription was delivered to the Leahy name. So, interestingly enough, issue number 7 features a detailed breakdown of the infamous White House farm murders in England, right? This is a case where a killer stages this violent multiple murder to look like a suicide. And it's only to be exposed because the rifle was too long for the victim to have shot herself, right? So, to me, that's a terrifying parallel. It's like a blueprint for staging a scene, and it's executed by someone who thought that they could possibly craft, I guess, the perfect crime. Now, here's a little bit more about the gun, right? So enter, I'm just going to call her Pam. Enter Pam, who is Vikki Arnold's next-door neighbour. So on August the 23rd, I believe it was, 1991, Pam went into Vicky's vacant carport to retrieve a borrowed lawnmower. So tucked on top of the mower's frame was this heavy, damp pillowcase. So Pam claims when she opened it, she was pretty stunned because inside was the cut-off barrel and the butt of the Rufer rifle, an instruction manual, cleaning rods, and a hacksaw. So interestingly enough, the pillowcase itself had really faint handwriting on it, and it said 6 Rose Street, Anitra Graham. So this is a pillowcase that was originated from the Leahy household, one of Julianne and Alan's daughters. Right? Police said they'd searched that carport extensively in the days after the disappearance, and they all confirmed that these items were definitely not there. Did someone creep into that carport to plant evidence? Anyway, Pam later testifies that she heard suspicious noises outside her flat in the pre-dawn hours of August 23rd. She even claims that she spotted a man running away in the dark. So, is that a stranger? Why would someone sneak into a crime scene adjacent property to plant gun parts in a family pillowcase? There's really only one reason that I can gather, and it seems like that is to frame Vicki and cement the police's early narrative. So remember, it's a murder-suicide, and they wanted to focus on this, quick narrative that just, it doesn't fit with physical evidence. There's too many indiscrepancies, and now the car's been towed, and we can't even keep up with the mess that this case has become, right? So while that, they're focusing on this narrative, there is a lot of whispers around the tablelands, and it's pointed in a completely different direction, right? So one of Julianne's sisters was allegedly dating a man named Chris Dunley. Now, Chris Dunley was supposed to have been working beside Alan. Vicki was also doing their paperwork, their accounting side of things, right? Now, Chris Dunley, he's a figure known very well in our regional criminal circles. Like, he's associated with some pretty bad standover tactics, some illegal networks that operated around far north Queensland during that era. And in later legal reviews, Dunley was actually named as a potential third party who moved through that area during those critical weeks. So the emergence of Chris Dunley as potentially a suspect, there again, directly challenges this initial police narrative, right? It highlights that third-party violence is a serious line of inquiry. Investigators still failed to pursue it. Right? It's just, it blows my mind. So then let's fast forward to March the 1st, 2013, right? After 22 years of this absolutely heartbreaking, painful uncertainty for the family, especially of Vikki Arnold. She has been labelled as somebody who murdered her best friend and then committed suicide. 22 years of that. State Coroner Barnes has delivered his definitive 127-page judgment in Brisbane. It would seem that Coroner Barnes did not mince his words. He slammed that initial 1991 police investigation. He called out tunnel vision of regional officers who rushed to declare a murder-suicide within 60 minutes, all seemingly to protect local overtime budgets. He systematically dismantled previous inquest verdicts. So Coroner Barnes officially wiped this stain from Vikki Arnold's name. He formally declared that she was completely innocent of killing Julianne Leahy. So he established that both women died of intentionally inflicted gunshot wounds at the hands of a third party. Now, even looking back over this case, I feel like that's something that we all can recognize. At the time, obviously, a lot of things were in play, and it just didn't happen that way, and it should have. So the coroner detailed Alan Leahy's absolute financial ruin. So his got this life insurance payout, his inconsistent statements, even right down to these planted gun parts. The coroner also detailed his ongoing sexual abuse and coaching of Julianne's teenage sister, which I feel is like a very key piece to this puzzle. So Coroner Barnes concluded that the circumstantial evidence against Alan Leahy was so compelling that a properly instructed jury could convict him. So then came the moment that actually sent shockwaves through the entire legal system. So pursuant to section, I believe it's section 41. Let me check. Yeah, pursuant to section 41 of the Coroner's Act, State Coroner Michael Barnes formally commits Alan Noel Thomas Leahy to stand trial for the murder of Vikki Arnold and Julianne Leahy. He actually orders a warrant for his arrest. Imagine how both of those families are feeling right now. Like, that's huge. And it's years later. So just a couple of days after that, Alan Leahy surrenders himself to police authorities. And while legal challenges, there's lost physical evidence, and there's absolutely decades of procedural failures that ultimately hampered this criminal trial prosecution, it would seem that the truth could no longer be hidden. Like, for 22 years, two families fought through their grief. And I mean, we're talking about a small community in Atherton, so the public judgment was huge. And then, not to mention, institutional denial. These families refused to let a budget-driven police narrative define the legacy of these two young women whose lives were cut so short at Cherry Tree Creek. Vikki Arnold was not a killer. She was a loyal and protective friend. Julianne Leahy was a devoted mother who was seemingly seeking a way out of a dark situation with her husband, Alan. So the shadows of Cherry Tree Creek, after 22 years, seem to have finally been brought into the light. But then, have they? Have they really? So across these episodes, we did trace the story that took 22 years to unlock, and it began when local police looked into one single theory within 60 minutes of arriving at Cherry Tree Creek, declaring it a murder-suicide, branding Vikki Arnold a killer before physical evidence was even catalogued. Right, so for over 2 decades, that initial investigation absolutely poisoned the truth. It completely overlooked how Vicki had even acquired that .22 Ruger rifle through a local acquaintance who is still alive today. I'd love to talk to him. Please reach out, Mr. Wilkinson, if you are listening to this podcast. So this is a weapon that ballistics later proved that she lacked manual strength or dexterity to crudely modify with this hand hacksaw, right? It ignored the planted pillowcase in her vacant carport, even the sheer physical impossibility of the self-inflicted gunshot from the footwell of that vehicle. So when Coroner Barnes delivered that landmark ruling. He completely exonerated Vikki Arnold and formally committed Alan Leahy to stand trial for murder. Unfortunately, because of those initial 1991, shall we call them bungles by the police, it allowed physical evidence to degrade, disintegrate, or be lost even, and the criminal prosecution ultimately stalled. So Alan maintained his innocence right up until his death, and it left the coronial warrant as the final legal word in the case. So, yeah, that legal record might be closed for Alan, but for anyone who looks closely at Cherry Tree Creek, there are still some massive and haunting questions that linger there, right? So was Alan Leahy actually working alone? And what role, if any, did figures like Chris Dunley play in this surrounding web of convoluted events? So we've also got, the brutal logistics of the terrain itself. And this is the question that I ask myself all the time. If Alan actually executed those two women in the pitch black of the night in that really remote scrub, how on earth did he get off that hill, right? So I had somebody approach me and tell me that they believe from conversations they had back then with people who were involved in the case, that Alan walked the railway line back to Atherton after he killed the women. Now, I've personally walked that old railway track from Cherry Tree Creek all the way into Atherton. I don't even know how to describe it. It's treacherous, it's steep, it's extremely uneven, and in the pitch black of night, I feel like it's impossible. So navigating that, I was in broad daylight and it was a challenge. Navigating that in the dead of the night without any sort of light source, I mean, it seems virtually impossible to me. Did Chris Dunley pick Alan up in a different vehicle from Cherry Tree Creek and drive back to Atherton? Oh, like I said, so many questions. When police searched the vehicle, actually, there was no torch to be found. So two women went fishing in the middle of the night without a torch. Again, doesn't make sense to me. Did the killer carry a torch up that track? Did they then use it to guide their way back down through the scrub? Second vehicle, a getaway driver waiting on that access road into Cherry Tree Creek. Was it Chris Dunley? I guess we'll never know because he died in 1994 as well, after admitting to a cellmate that he did, in fact, kill those women. There's also a really interesting article, which I'll post up on the Facebook page, Instagram page, and TikTok page for you to read. I think it's called and excuse the French, but this is the headline in the paper at the time, Two Bitches, Wrong Place. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that was the headline. I will definitely be posting that up for everybody to read. It is pretty confronting, but that's how it was at the time, We may never, ever get final answers to how that night truly played out there in Cherry Tree Creek. But I guess one thing to be grateful for, Vikki Arnold was not a killer. She was an innocent victim, and so was Julianne. So, for their families, those long years of fighting, it was to finally restore truth, and the memory of these two young women, so that their name's not tainted like that. It's a stain. And I'm glad that Coroner Barnes could see through the absolute agonizing rot of what you would call an initial investigation, because there's just too many discrepancies and too many questions, and sadly I don't know if they'll ever be answered. So thanks for listening to this special series on Forgotten FNQ. Feel free to visit our official show page. We've got, pictures of the vehicle after it was towed and the gun, etc. coronial transcripts and case documentation and stuff on our Facebook page, Instagram, and TikTok. Don't forget to, rate, review, and even subscribe on all of your listening stations. I think we're on Spotify, iHeartRadio, quite a few. So until next time, stay safe, keep asking hard questions, and let's never let their stories be forgotten.